Hey, I am Mustafa Sharif. Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I'm looking forward to this episode. It's going to be super interesting. We're going to talk about human behavior, how should we rethink places, and much other interesting things. I have the pleasure to welcome my guest, Josef Conning, to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome, Josef.
Thank you, Mustafa. It's great to be here.
So, how are you doing, Josef?
I'm doing good. It's good to be here. I'm well and healthy. I've been fortunate not to be too affected personally by the pandemic. So yeah, I'm happy.
Well, that's great to hear. And also the weather today in Stockholm, it's amazing. Very sunny, very beautiful.
Yeah, really. It's really summer now.
So thank you so much, Josef, for joining Urbanistica podcast. I really appreciate that you give your time to record the episode.
My pleasure.
You're our storyteller, so please tell us, how would you like to introduce yourself and what are you passionate about?
So I'm an urbanist and senior consultant at Augur, and we help clients with insights, innovation, strategy, and we do projects in all industries and categories. But I specialize in urbanism and mobility. Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. But for as long as I can remember, I've always been drawn to cities. I grew up in a very small, sleepy town, and when I was a kid, my grandmother lived here in the central parts of Stockholm, and we would visit her a lot. As I was growing up, and I remember as a kid, I used to stand by her window, looking out at the street in the evenings, and I could see all the city life that was going on there, and that was sort of I could see this energy of like this big city street that I wouldn't see in the tiny town I grew up in. And I guess I was drawn to and fascinated by that energy, on the streets outside. And that is sort of that stuck with me, and that is why I'm passionate about cities. I think that energy, and later in life, when I went to university, I studied cognitive science. Which is a multidisciplinary field exploring human cognition and behavior in complex systems. But I couldn't let go of my fascination with cities. So on the side, I read all the great urbanists like, Jane Jacobs, Jean Gehl, Richard Florida, Edward Glaeser, and so on. And that's how I learned the field of urbanism initially, at least.
So it was a self-learning journey.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Basically, what you do is you study how humans behave in the urban city.
Exactly. So I do urbanism projects on two levels, I would say. So on one level, it's very hands-on street level projects where we look at how people behave and use and relate to the city. And on a higher level, it's more forward-looking, trend-oriented reports and analyses covering like major urban shifts and the role cities play on like the global arena. So it's, I would say it's both how people, behave and relate to the city, but also cities themselves, what they are as an entity in the world.
Yeah. And how do you do that? Do you talk to people? Do you do it by observation? What are the different methods that you use?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do talk to people. That's usually the way I work, and so usually the purpose of my research is to understand how people experience and relate to a place or a city or a building, even in some time at times, and in some cases. And either way, I need to understand how people use it, what they think about it, how they view it. regardless of whether it's a place, a building, a city, a block, a street. And I also need to know or want to know how it could be even more useful to them or give them a better experience in some way. We involve people living in those areas, in the cities we're studying, people who live there or work there or visit there or hang out there or just, pass by there. That's who we're interested in talking to, essentially. And we're both interested in the functionality and the physical dimensions of a place, and meaning how people, use it, what they do there, how they move around in that space, but also the identity and emotional dimensions of that place, how people relate to it, how they feel about it. And to capture all this, we do qualitative research, quantitative research, and trend research. And qualitative research essentially is interviews and focus groups and workshops. So I do a lot of on-site interviews, for instance, where I hang out with people in an area. We walk around there, we visit coffee shops and stores, and we do things these people normally would do there. And all while we're talking about their experiences of that area, right? So, for instance, I've done this in projects. I've done that in a project about this area, this part of Södermalm, for instance, because we did this study a few years ago about what urban qualities a place needs to attract people and companies working in creative industries, and how those qualities, can manifest themselves in like the physical space. So sometimes we walk around with, one person at a time. Sometimes we walk around with groups of people. Recently we did this project in Liljeholmen where we wanted to understand the interest in culture and nightlife in that particular area. And it's an area with great potential in regards to culture and nightlife, even though the range of those experiences is quite limited, to be honest, right now. But there's a lot going on there, as I'm sure you're familiar with, like Lövholmen, for instance, that area. So it's really helpful and interesting to talk to people while they are talk to people about something while they are experiencing it. Well, that provides so much more detail and so many more clues about what you can do there. So qualitative research is probably, my main method, I would say, but we do need more general understanding. At times we need to involve wider groups of people in some cases, so we do a lot of quantitative research as well with surveys, questionnaires. We use other behavioral data to quantify insights, and in addition to that we do a lot of trend research where we capture more high-level shifts, innovations that might not come up in primary research. So we do a lot of reading, a lot of interviews with experts, researchers, architects, urbanists in various, or people in various fields actually.
That's super interesting. So it means that you need always to be up to date, reading the news, what's happening in the city, and talking to people in order to catch the latest update in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is good for me because I'm a very curious person. So I like to, listen to people. I like to have my tentacles out to pick up things that might, happen around the city. So yeah, it's a good fit for me.
Yeah, it's also super interesting. And I would love to know, do we behave different within the same place? I mean, it depends on the age, gender, background.
Absolutely. There are a lot of things influencing how we, relate to or experience or use the city. And that's why we need to be mindful of who we are designing cities for. And we need to understand the experiences and behavior and needs of everyone using the city, not just one or a few groups. And in some cases, we might want to attract new groups to a place if those groups are missing today. It's important not to rely too much on the preconceptions of decision makers or planners or architects. We need to listen to people and observe people in the city to understand that fully and sufficiently. And doing research, it's really important to involve all relevant groups of people, and not only those who happens to be there right now or those using one of the functions in that area. We need to get a broader understanding. And as I'm sure you know, I mean, actually you're an urban planner, so you would know more about this than I do. But traditionally the modernist city was primarily designed by and for men, typically, and that is something we still cope with today, unfortunately. But luckily things are changing, and we understand the problems with that now. So yeah, it's really important to involve all groups of people.
Yeah, and what makes us humans to be attracted to a place? Is there like elements in a place that attract us?
Yeah, I mean, that is the $1 million question, right? But I don't think there's a magic formula. There's no one specific thing that you could like apply everywhere and then people would come there. I think there's this quote, I hope I remember it correctly now, but the great urbanist William White, I think he said something like, what attracts people most, it would appear, is other people. And I think that's really important to remember. In most cases, we want to be around other people, right? So it's really important to understand those drivers and needs and experiences and aspirations of people that we want to get to or attract to a specific place. But we also need to understand the identity, the role, the functions, the meaning of that specific place, because what attracts people there, the gravitational forces can be different for different places, or typically they are different from place to place.
What do you see now in how we behave? Is there any places in the city that we are not using anymore and we are more attracted to other places? How do you see the city now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some changes or shifts going on, actually, and some functions and amenities that have been very much in focus in our cities and city centers are becoming less relevant. And I don't think it's not news to anyone to talk about like stores and shopping malls and traditional office spaces. We know this is something we knew before the global pandemic we're in now. We don't use them anymore, or as much anymore. We do use them, obviously, but we don't use them as much as we used to. And their position in our cities are becoming less and less prominent, if that makes sense. And also looking at what the streets look like, if we would look into the future a little bit, it's likely that in a few years, maybe 5, maybe 10, I don't know, but in a few years we won't be needing street parking, for instance, because cars will bring us to our doors and then they will drop us off and then they will go park themselves somewhere else until we need them again and call for them with our phones, maybe. So maybe 5, maybe 10 years from now, street parking will be rendered irrelevant, more or less. So that obviously frees up a lot of space in our cities, and together with like stores or shopping malls having to close and office spaces having to close because work is much more distributed now. We can work from homes, from our homes, from coffee shops, from some summer houses, from wherever, essentially. There would be a lot of space in our cities that we can use in other ways. I think many of the functions that are becoming less prominent, spatially in our cities, I think they are very, practical functions. As humans, we still have a lot of drivers and needs and dreams. We want to hang out with our friends. We want to meet new people. We want to learn new things, be inspired, express ourselves in various ways, and so on. So I think that urban spaces, to a greater extent, need to accommodate those experiences, and experiences that are more centered around being social, having fun, being inspired, learning, and less, with less practical focus, if that makes sense. And I think that that's an interesting shift, I think. And I'm not saying that all stores or malls or office spaces or other basic functions will go away entirely, but I think there's an interesting shift in how we need to program our cities. And I think all this calls for more participatory and inclusive urban design, meaning I think we need to involve people more, and it becomes even more important to involve people. You can't really design great experiences without involving the end user, which in this case would be the people using the city.
Yeah, and this is what I wanted to ask you about. How do we create the experience that people want?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's important to, as I said, I think it's really important to involve people and interview them, talk to them, spend time with them, and find relevant people for whatever place you're working with. So if you work with a specific block, you need to involve people that are relevant for that block. So the people living there, working there, hanging out there, spending time there, shopping there, passing by there, changing trains there or whatever, or people you want to attract to that place if there are groups of people that sort of are missing there that you want to see there. And also the companies, obviously, in that area, in that block. And interview them, talk to them, understand their drivers and needs and experiences and goals and dreams and aspirations, and also involve them in the design process, co-create with them, essentially. And I mean, that is basically what placemaking and design thinking teach us.
Yes, but also, Josef, not all the projects have enough money to include people, to have this, flexibility and doing interviews. Do you think it's because the lack of the money, or because it's the lack of creativity in designing the process?
I'm not sure I have a good answer for it, though, but I don't think there's a lack of creativity anywhere, actually, because, people, I think everyone I've met working with this is very, very creative. Sometimes you are limited by, regulation or different, processes, but very rarely people are, not creative. So I absolutely think we have the creativity we need, but maybe in some cases we need to find ways to utilize that creativity and harvest that creativity.
Yeah. So you believe that even if it is a small project, there is still a possibility to include people. So it's
Absolutely.
just a matter of how you design the process.
Yeah, I think so, really. And I think, it might be a little bit more time consuming or expensive short term to involve people, but long term for sure I'm 100% certain that it will be more efficient, more cheaper in the long term to involve people from the outset.
So, Yusuf, do you think that in Stockholm we are brave to rethink spaces and places, or what do you see?
I think there are a lot of interesting initiatives in Stockholm, and I think there is a lot of creativity in Stockholm. There are so many talented and creative urbanists, like yourself, for instance.
Thank you.
But I think there's a level of NIMBYism in this city. Strong conservative forces holding back a lot of relevant and interesting and important development that we really need. I think there are a lot of people wanting this city to look like it always has, essentially, and I don't think that's a very good idea for a city. I think a city should live and develop and evolve and change. I think that's really important, and so I think to answer your question, I think there is a lot of creativity, but also there are forces holding that back or counteracting that creativity, unfortunately.
Yeah. So whose responsibility to rethink the city, or at least some spaces in the city? Is it the municipality, the architects, the people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think obviously the municipality and the landowners are ultimately responsible for a lot of the urban planning and development. I also think there needs to be a collaboration between all actors in the city. All stakeholders, the municipality, the landowners, companies, housing co-ops, inhabitants, regular, people, ordinary people. And I think it's important for, I think probably landowners and the municipality, they have a great responsibility when it comes to inviting others into, this collaboration. Because a lot of people are sort of expecting that they will deal with that, but at the same time, I think it's important to make people or help people be more engaged and committed and more involved. So yeah, I think it's very important for them to open up for people and support people in taking part in that co-creation and collaboration, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And is it possible that we talked about places need to be an attraction point?
Sure.
Attractive.
Yeah.
Is it possible that every single place or space on this planet that can be developed to be an attractive place?
Well, for someone, sure, absolutely. I don't think every place on Earth should be, probably. I mean, I don't really see the point of that. But, sure, all places have potential, absolutely. You just have to find the right target group for that place and understand that target group and the drivers and needs of that target group and ultimately, develop that place in a way that would attract those people, I guess.
Yeah. And in Urbanistica, so we talk a lot about smart city and technology. So in this case, how much technology can help us to rethink, redesign places?
Right. I think technology is really a really important tool for us to use to make cities more sustainable and more livable and lovable. But technology itself and infrastructure itself isn't, the interesting part of it. I guess I've done a lot of studies about smart cities and how city leaders, experience the transition into or transformation into smart cities and the challenges in that. But I think we always come back to the goals, the end goal of smart cities, which is essentially sustainable cities, and that's something more important to focus on. And then in order to get there, we need to make cities smarter. We need to have better traffic planning systems or waste management systems, or we can use the very granular sensory system that we have now in cities, because everybody is more or less everybody is wearing a smartphone. So we have this super granular sensory system that we can use, and we can get a lot of important data that we can use to make cities more sustainable and more livable and lovable. So I think technology is really important, and we can do a lot of exciting stuff with that, but that is not the most interesting part of it.
So I believe we have the technology, but we need the mindset in order to plan and design cities for people.
Exactly, yeah, really. And also we need to be mindful so that we don't use all the technology we have in malicious ways, because it's possible to use technology for things we absolutely shouldn't use it for. So we need to be mindful at the same time how we use it, for sure.
We need to be smart in order to plan a smart city.
Absolutely, yeah. We need to be smart about our smartness, I guess. Yeah.
Yes. So Josef, we have a really smart machine that takes you back in time, and when you're back in time, you're allowed to change one thing, and it should be related to architecture, urban planning, and design. So what will you change if you're back in time?
Wow. Yeah, I would probably go back and change or thwart this crazy idea that cities should be functionally separated and distributed. So, I don't know really when that idea gained momentum, but probably 100 years ago, in the early 20th century, I guess. But I would really go back and, totally thwart that idea.
Yeah.
Because that idea is the root of so much problem we have today still. Many of our current sustainability challenges are related to that idea of functionally separate and distribute cities.
Yeah. Hopefully now what we are planning now, the future generation will not need to go back in time and say, I would love to change that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to hear what people in 100 years, what they will say about what we do today. And all the mistakes we do today, because obviously we are making mistakes today.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be really interesting and also horrible, probably terrifying.
If you now are able to add one thing to all the cities on this planet, what will you add? Something related to architecture, urban planning, and design.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I think I would like to see, I'm thinking about Stockholm now primarily, but I think this is quite general, probably. I would like to see some regulation around, mixed use. So when we develop our cities, we have to mix functionalities and we have to include different types of programming for each, I don't know, maybe block by block even, to counteract monofunctional areas and counteract the need to drive between places, essentially.
Yeah.
Right.
And what do you think about the future? Are we really taking actions in order to rethink the places?
Absolutely. I'm an optimist for sure, and I think we learn every day. We're making mistakes every day, but we also learn every day. So I think I absolutely think it will be better and one both difficult but also amazing thing about cities is that we're never done with cities. We don't finish a city. We can't really, you can complete one building, but you can't sort of complete one city, if that makes sense. We learn as we go by, and I think we will improve, we will do things better, we will keep making mistakes, obviously, but I'm optimistic about the future and our urban future, for sure.
Yeah, that's very lovely and very promising. Thank you so much again for this really inspiring conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I also want to commend you on this podcast, because I think you're doing such an amazing job with this, and this conversation that you're having about cities and urban life is really important. And I know you're a big fan of Jan Gehl, and I know he said that we know more about good habitats for mountain gorillas and Siberian tigers than we do about good habitats for human beings. And I think by having this conversation about cities and urban life that you have here in this podcast, I think you're contributing to the distribution of knowledge about cities, our primary human habitat. So I think that's really great. Just want to say that.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear that from you. So how would you like to summarize what we talked about, your reflections and 3 takeaway messages to all Urbanistica podcast listeners?
Yeah, so the 3 key takeaways from this discussion, I would say, is involve people and co-create. Another thing, plan for the unplanned. Leave spaces for bottom-up initiatives to grow. We didn't really talk about that before, but I just want to say I think another consequence of this shift, where cities become more oriented or centered around non-practical experiences, is that I think that will contribute to a shift from top-down to bottom-up urbanism, actually. I think traditionally, most urban development happens very much top-down. At least in Sweden, public spaces are planned by and developed by the municipality or the landowner or companies working on their behalf, right? But I think as the city becomes more centered around human experiences, I think people, like the regular inhabitants in the city, will start caring more actively about the urban spaces they live in. And I think they want to be more active and more actively contribute and co-create, right? Just to give you one example, I was in Amsterdam a few years back to do a study on urban farming, and walking around in the neighborhoods there, I noticed a lot of micro parks on the sidewalks, and you would see just a few plants, maybe a chair, and I got really curious about that. So as it turns out, people living there just decide to create tiny green oases in their neighborhoods. Someone just start to put out plants on the sidewalk, and maybe someone else, puts out a chair where you can sit and read or have a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you have this micro park there on the sidewalk, entirely created bottom up. And I think this mindset and this approach will be more common in our cities as well, as they are becoming more centered around those non-practical experiences, right? So I think it's really important to as I said, plan for the unplanned and leave space for those initiatives. And the third takeaway I want to mention, the importance of playfulness and gamification, because that is such a powerful method to make cities more lovable, more sustainable. So don't shy away from playfulness and gamification in cities, which is important for municipalities and planners to keep in mind, really.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your powerful messages. And so, do you have interesting, cool, and powerful hashtags for the episode?
Well, cool. Whether they are cool or not, it's not up to me to judge. But the first one I want to mention is cities for people, because there's so much inspiration, knowledge there. You know, if you follow that hashtag, you're gonna get so much interesting and important information. And finally, I want to say Urbanistica podcast, because I really think it's important to keep up with this super important and interesting conversation that you're facilitating here in your podcast. I think it's really great. I know you had a lot of super interesting, talented, amazing guests before me, which makes this super humbling for me to be here as a guest. You've talked to so many inspiring and truly brilliant people, brilliant urban minds. So absolutely follow Urbanistica podcast to stay updated.
Thank you so much, Josef.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, what are you going to do now? What is the next step for you? By the way, did you plan for your summer vacation?
Yeah, well, both yes and no, I guess, because, you know, at times like this, you don't really know where you can go. And it's not easy being from Stockholm nowadays, because not everybody welcomes you anymore. So probably I will stay in Sweden this summer. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. Please don't forget to follow on Instagram and subscribe the YouTube channel for live talks. If you have any great story that makes our city smarter, please contact me. Urbanistica is being produced in collaboration with Landskapslaget, that working with landscape architecture, urban planning and design, based in Stockholm, and also the European Placemaking Network. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.